It's a short list. The U.S. State Department's official state sponsors of terrorism. They include Cuba, North Korea, Iran, Syria, and, well, I guess you'd add Gaza or the West Bank if they were officially states. But I would add one more to that list after Monday, the United States. Hey, everybody, I'm Steve Green with Bill Whittle and Scott Ott, and this is Right Angle, brought to you by the members of BillWhittle.com. Gentlemen, for only, I think, the second time in this country's last 50 years, probably, we sided with the terrorists against Israel. I'm very, very sad to say. Usually whenever the UN decides to have some stupid vote to punish Israel for defending itself, the U.S. ambassador to the United States exercises our veto power and vetoes the resolution, the stupid demand, whatever it is. And this time, the first time was under Barack Obama, as that administration was walking out the door in 2016. Most recent times, Biden administration on Monday, they've been haggling for days over a ceasefire resolution, demanding a ceasefire against Israel, essentially, since Hamas is on the ropes. That would give Hamas a chance to regroup and go back to the serious business of murdering Jews. And the United States really, really wanted to vote for this ceasefire demand. And when we couldn't get our way, and our way was including this tiny little detail that Hamas should release some hostages, and when Biden couldn't get that, they decided instead to abstain, which was effectively voting for the ceasefire resolution because it was only our veto preventing it from being approved by the UN. Bill, about the only thing I can say about this that's anything good is that it's a UN resolution, so it's essentially toothless. But if you are Hamas and you see the Biden White House essentially taking your side on this issue, you got to be feeling pretty good about yourselves right now, huh?
Yeah, I would imagine that if you're in the White House, you're thinking about states like, I don't know, maybe Michigan or Minnesota, someplace like that, where the Arab American population has exceeded the Jewish American population by some significant margin. This shift after the events of October, this progressively, if you'll pardon the expression, more pro-Hamas position that the United States has been taking, seems to be connected to the lowest form of political pandering. I mean, genuinely, when I say the lowest form, it's a low thing to do to sacrifice any principles in order to get votes. But that's why some people become politicians, because they don't cast a reflection. But when you're talking about something that is this morally clear, and you decide you're going to start drifting, in order to maximize returns from states that you may need in terms of electoral votes in 2024, there's just I can't think of a whole lot of terms that don't sound like prostitution or blackmail or extortion or any of these other unsavory human activities that we find ourselves cursed with. I would rather be right than consistent. And so it's not like I think that you could lock in an American foreign policy, but I do think that if you did have a foreign policy that's basically this, we're on the side of freedom and civilization and human happiness and stability and fun. And if you are trying to destroy those things, then we're against you. And if you're in favor of those things, then we're for you. And I think if you were just to take it as like, which side is the pro-freedom side? And if we were to stand on that side, not only do I think we'd have a more effective foreign policy and a much better look in the mirror when we wake up in the mornings, I think we'd be a lot more popular around the world, and I think we'd be a lot more effective too. Yeah, and that's the thing that gets lost in all the seriousness of this is we're on the side of gas guzzling pickup trucks, rock and roll, and bikini girls. We need to emphasize this point. Oh, it used to be. Well, the real America still is. It's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And always will be, by the way. Scott, you might be shocked to learn that Hamas did a little victory lap visiting their sponsors in Tehran on Monday. Now they've decided to up their demands. They want not just a ceasefire, they want a restructuring plan, which of course will involve the U.S. spending billions and billions to
rebuild their infrastructure. Yeah, and by infrastructure, of course, I mean showy apartment buildings on top of Gaza and plenty of terrorists hiding tunnels underneath Gaza because, well, they've done it before. They'll do it again if they're allowed to exist. But on Monday, Hamas rejected an Israeli ceasefire proposal, even though they wanted the UN one. It was a 6-week ceasefire, which was based on exchanging 40 hostages, just 40 of the approximately 130 hostages that Hamas still has, in exchange for, the figures differ, between 700 and 800 Palestinian prisoners, including 100 convicted murderers, that Jerusalem would be willing to let Hamas have back in exchange for just a third of the hostages Hamas has. If you're Hamas and you know the White House has your back now, why shouldn't they hold out for more?
I find this to be sickening, and I'm glad that the Israeli delegation that was planning to come to Washington at the invitation of the administration has decided not to. The last I heard, after some of these things that you're talking about here, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been very clear about the objectives in this war: hostages free, Hamas gone. Hostages free, Hamas gone. They're not trying to kill civilians. They're not trying to do some sort of genocidal thing there. Every time you hear in the media the report of casualties or of deaths in Gaza, they say, well, the health authorities in the Palestinian region report that 30,000 are dead. What the Israelis can point out, if the media would ever talk to them and then put on the air or online, what they say is that about half of those killed were actually terrorists. They were actually combatants, hostiles. And if you compare, in every war, there are civilian casualties along with combatant casualties. And if you compare a 1-to-1 ratio of civilian to combatant casualties with most other wars, Israel comes out doing as well as you can possibly hope in a war, and even better considering that Hamas uses civilian infrastructure that is desperately needed by civilians as a hiding place. Last week, they had Israel had to do an assault on a hospital in order to kill 50 terrorists, including some of the terror leaders in there. And so this idea that somehow Israel is the bad guy in this war could end tomorrow. Hostages free, Hamas gone. But nobody involved except for Israel seems to want that end. And this is the real kicker, because they still do public surveys, polling, opinion polling in the territory, and 70% of the residents of Gaza support not just Hamas, but support the October 7th attack that brutally, savagely killed 1,200 Israeli civilians. They support the attack. These are not, when you have 70% of the population supporting an attack on innocent civilians by terrorist combatants, you can't then say, oh, well, most people in that territory are somehow innocent civilians. No, they are fellow travelers. They are supporters and enablers. They are Hamas. So if you really want the shooting to stop from Israel, turn over all the Hamas combatants and release all the hostages. But the problem is, it looks like if you do that, 2/3 of the residents of Gaza or more would have to be turned over.
I just kind of pitch in something here because of what Scott said. First of all, the evidence that there's not an actual Israeli-caused genocide in Gaza is the fact that there are people still alive in Gaza. Because if they really genuinely wanted to do a genocide, this is something they could have done in the space of 3 or 4 days. So there's always that. This business about, we're gonna from the river to the sea. If Israel wanted to push the Palestinians into the ocean, they could do it in a weekend. And there's your proof, and that's all you need. But to the other issue, the reason that Hamas murdered those people is because they wanted Israel to come into Gaza and kill civilians. That was the strategy. We will go kill enough of Jews so that they have no choice but to respond with overwhelming force, and then we'll get to put our own people's dead bodies on camera, and that's a win for us. And so when you wonder why this, what could possibly drive this kind of hatred, your answer is in what you mentioned just a minute ago. When you're talking about a prisoner swap, we'll give you 700 of yours for 40 of ours. That's the mentality on the receiving end, on the Palestinian end, that drives that kind of hatred. Their own government is basically saying, yes, we'll make a deal. The Palestinian government is going to make a deal that says, we will give you 40 of your people if you give us 700 of ours. What else do you need to say?
Yeah, and this is not a one-time thing. Israel has made deals like this going back for 50 years now.
Of course.
Yeah. My favorite argument, my favorite evidence, I should say, against there being any sort of genocide against the Arab residents of Gaza was the Gaza dude himself posting this video. I can't remember which platform it was, but I've seen the video in numerous places now, complaining about the quality of the MREs that we'd airdropped.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Everybody
Steve,
complains about MREs. Welcome to the army, pal.
There are many Muslims and Arabs living peacefully side by side with Jews in Israel.
Yes.
So,
correct.
So this who are working in normal jobs,
voting in the elections,
are allowed to go and worship as they please, vote in the elections, whose own compatriots or fellow religionists are part of the government. So this is idiotic to suggest that Israel is the bad guy here. And for the United States, at least nominally, and from the administration, it's not the United States really. It's this guy and his cronies, but. For us to be taking an official position against the only friend we have in the Middle East is absurd and dangerous.
And wrong-headed. It'll come back to bite us on the ass, I guarantee it.
No.
And Scott, I'm glad you mentioned the assault on the Hamas-held hospital last week. Actually, I think it continued into this week. David Bernstein mentioned on Twitter/X earlier this week that Israel was actually, the IDF was very careful to kill as few of the Hamas terrorists in the hospital as they could. They took as many prisoners as they possibly could for interrogation in order to find the location or even just whether they're alive of these remaining 130 hostages. And I've come to the conclusion, this is a terrible thing to have to say, but I've come to the conclusion that I don't believe many or perhaps even any of those 130 hostages are still alive, that one of the reasons Hamas is rejecting generous offer after generous offer is they don't have any living or many living hostages left to trade. And
I bet you those hostages didn't die of natural causes either.
Of course they didn't. And it's been almost 6 months now, or just a couple of weeks short of 6 months of being held hostage in terrible conditions and subject to the whims of these Hamas terrorists. If any of those people are still alive, it'll be a miracle. I hope they're rescued safely. But as Israel gets ready to move into Rafah, which is one of the last strongholds of Hamas in Gaza, the one that Kamala Harris says is a red line that Israel doesn't dare cross, the one that President Biden says will cut off your weapons and your ammo if you do this. Again, giving cover to Hamas. We're a terror sponsor nation now. It makes me sick. But if the IDF were to change course, and I don't mean in an official sense, but if the individual soldiers adopt a take no prisoners attitude when they do move into Rafah, could you blame them after Hamas murdered all of theirs? No. And that's your right angle on that, brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time, hopefully with better news.